Hey guys, Luton here, welcome back for Below the Line. Now this week I want to ask, what's better, unlocked versus progression in FPS games? Essentially we're thinking about comparing the incomparable COD and Battlefield versus something like Arma and Squad. But wait, don't launch into a mouth-foaming rant just yet. I'm not talking about comparing the games like for like, that would be insane. What we're talking about is what effect does unlocking all your weapons have on the player versus earning them through experience-based grinding and special achievement missions. It's something I've thought about often, and hearing from players recently as well when they spoke about the positive effects of not having to worry about unlocking your weapons. For one, coming into a game with all your weapons available means that the player doesn't have to think about fulfilling some criteria that detracts from the core game mode. This should help in people fighting more for the overall objective than in an effort to just gain a weapon. To be sure, this has changed in recent years because once upon a time you gained experience on your score and kills, and then you would just unlock weapons over time to get them. This was a nice and simple system that rewarded you for basically anything that you did, and it gave some sense of ongoing achievement for your efforts. But over time, things have become more and more complicated, more and more tweaked to give that sense of achievement, to give that endorphin rush of I've unlocked a thing. The games have even had more elements added into them for you to be able to unlock. Now many of these games now have some kind of either currency system you need to use or special ranking that means you can't unlock guns then in any order, combined with then special objectives as well to unlock things on top of that. It's kind of like the bare bones of arcade experience ranking. But it's also a convoluted pain in the ass, and honestly, I don't have time or inclination to be paying it that much attention. For me, it really makes me want to not only bother with that, but it just turns me off from the game as well now, because things have become so convoluted that now you almost end up with a game inside of a game. You used to be able to just play the game and over time you would be unlocking stuff. Now yeah, for sure, you could maybe gain a bit more experience by gaining more kills or more objective points from getting onto your flags or whatever, and that would boost you forward a little bit, but ultimately it meant that everyone was kind of on a similar gaining scale. But now it's all over the place, and like I say, it's a game within a game. Now another positive for not having some kind of unlocking system is you don't have to worry about how things are balanced. It's fairly logical that if you have a progression from default to highest exclusivity of weapon, you're going to expect that that top end weapon is going to have to be somewhat better than the former, and that skews things. This though has created endless issues in the past where the top weapons end up being seen as OP, usually because they kind of are. It's a similar case for weapons that have special requirements to achieve them, although I personally did enjoy in Battlefield how they held that hilariously complicated process to unlock the Phantom Bow, only to then give it away to everybody else shortly afterwards, and that gave me a chuckle to be sure. The Phantom Bow in Battlefield though is a great example of how badly these kind of insane unlocking achievements break games. At the time, you couldn't even get into a game without a third of your team running around doing whatever the fuck it was you had to get those requirements. It was a miserable experience and it was game breaking. Still though, there are some positives for the audience that COD and Battlefield aim at. This kind of endorphin generating high of unlocking shiny things is what it's all about. Getting that new shiny helps extend people's attention and playtime, because there's always one more thing to get. You've got to get them all. Literally, that is why they include all those guns in the DLC, because sure as hell it's not because the game needs more guns. It's to give people something to do beyond, I don't know, playing the game. The positives to an unlocked gun system that I've spoken about with players recently in, say, Squad, which has had an influx of new players from its V10 update, but it equally applies to something like Arma. The positives to an unlocked gun system that I've spoken about with new players recently in Squad, which has had an influx of people from its V10 update, but it could apply equally to something like Arma as well. When speaking with public players about this, they've told me that initially not having to unlock weapons seemed strange and made them feel a bit flat about the game. But having actually got in and played the games through, they quickly realised how beneficial it can be. Now one guy I was speaking to told me that he'd been basically playing for about a week and he now didn't have this feeling that he had to worry about anything other than fighting for his team and the objective. He didn't have in the back of his head, oh, I've got to do X, Y, Z. He was just thinking about what he had to do in game because he didn't have to worry about all this other shit. And another thing as well, he said that it helped you to stay more focused on what you were doing, and it was liberating to be able to just pick what you wanted as it was available. Now, what I often do when I'm in games, I did this in Battlefield this week, I start talking to people in the chat, I start asking other players what they think, because I want to actually hear their opinions and actually see what's going on there and, you know, how it is that they actually feel. And what I heard by and large was from people that are playing Squad, new people into Squad, and even new people into Arma that I've seen, you know, commenting on my videos and stuff like this, people say they love it, they love that feeling. And from people that I've spoken to, it's pretty consistent about what they think on this topic. But the obvious caveat in all of this is that these style of games are very different. So in Arma and Squad, the damage model is very, very high. Squad balances its weapons by limiting classes to squad size and then capping classes within each squad. Now in Battlefield, you can pick whatever you want all the time, and the damage models are much softer as well in its base game. Similarly in COD as well. It's why they're arcade shooters and not simulations. Still though, if you could imagine what it would be like to come in, have less weapons so that they were balanced out, and then just make a loadout selection, focus then on what you're doing in the game and not have to worry about some stupid ass achievement or how much of X thing you were going to have to do in order to be able to get your guns. You could actually focus on just playing together. You can focus on improving yourself. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe people often don't have time to think about improving their ability to sort of flank, maneuver, to deal with different enemy, all these kind of things, because they're so busy trying to unlock all this basic crap. At the very least, you'd know that everybody else was doing the same thing, and wouldn't that be a positive thing? So guys, topic again for today, unlocked versus progression. What are the pros, what are the cons? Tell me what you think down in the comments below. So now we come to part 2 below the line, where we discuss your topics from the last week's video. It was about reskins always being talked about in a negative way, and that sometimes, you know, maybe devs should be a bit more upfront about the fact that, yeah, they're going to own it. They're actually going to just be like, yeah, we know our game was good, we're making a reskin version of it. Now, I think obviously some people were talking in the comments about how, well, that's fair enough, but we don't want to pay full price for it. Another angle that we were thinking about in this was that sometimes our devs actually just kind of trying to improve things which don't need improving, and in the process screwing them up, and we gave a few examples of that. So Jimbo comes in to say that personally I think reskins can be absolutely fine. In the case of 2 Point Hospital, yes, it does look very much like a reskin, but consider it has now been over 20 years since Theme Hospital was released, and with the technology we have available today, the visuals should be far superior. I would argue that's debatable looking at it, but whatever. Also, with the small amount of footage we saw in the video, they have also improved the mechanics. You can now create rooms that are not just square or rectangle, but an L shape, or whatever you can think of. Well, you would hope so, wouldn't you? You can also free place items in corridors and rooms, so yes, they will be similar, but have mechanical improvements also. Having 2 hospital games coming out in the future will hopefully push them to create a better game through competitiveness, and again, hopefully, we'll have 2 fantastic games to play that will appeal to different types of player. I think that's definitely true, and I think at least it gives something to everybody. You know, you can take your pick of what it is you want there. Back to the reskins topic though, there have been many games over the years that could have easily been considered reskins with small mechanical changes that have done very well. Just for a few examples, Command & Conquer series, Civ series, Battlefield series, Star Wars Bad Company 1, 2, 3, 4, even 1, Assassin's Creed, Sniper Elite, COD series, Tropico, Total War, Splinter Cell, Far Cry, a lot of the LEGO games, and most MMORPGs being copies of WoW. Many of these could be considered reskins. Yes, they might have different settings, weapons, sometimes stories, but usually the focus of these games is the improved graphics, which usually seems to overshadow new mechanics if there are any. It usually seems that depending on the amount of time that's passed between each title, the more mechanical changes and improvements have been made. For games that have had yearly releases, you can really see this. Just look at the Battlefield, COD and Assassin's Creed games especially, which had yearly releases. They all play very similar to their previous titles, if not exactly the same. In the Battlefield games, changing weapons and characters from modern to World War I to the Star Wars weapons, they're practically a reskin. If the game plays the same, then it is the same. There's something to be said for just doing a reskin with very little changes though. The player will know what they're getting, and it's a very safe approach. This kind of relates to what was said in the comment section of the video, where you mentioned people playing a new Battlefield game for a few weeks and the player base just dropping drastically. It's due to practically playing the same game as the last one, but very little has actually changed. Some people will stick to it to get achievements and guns and so on, but most just get bored and move on. On the flip side though, changing a game too much can leave people disappointed as the changes were too drastic. Command & Conquer 4, and we saw this in some of the degrees in Dawn of War 3. Changing the game too much is a big risk, and that's why many AAA devs and publishers avoid making too drastic a change. Can you imagine if EA made a drastic change to a Battlefield game as they did with Command & Conquer 4? It'd be a major risk. Some companies have done this and done well for themselves, while others have suffered or even gone completely under. Now I'm going to go straight into another comment first with Villafeed, who says there's a bit of catch-22 when it comes to reskins. The best example of this in my opinion is the yearly iteration of Madden. Every year about half the comments on that year's Madden are complaining that the current iteration is nothing more than a roster update with slightly better graphics, and the other half are complaining that mechanics are different than Madden 05. The only games that have been able to avoid this split are explicitly marketed as remasters or whatever, and then they catch flack, as they should, if the game is released at full price. There's a reason why I put those two comments together, because basically what we're talking about here is how do you define a reskin, what constitutes it, and it's ultimately kind of subjective, because what it comes back to is just how you see the updating and the development of a game. You know, if they don't change that much and they maybe do just improve the graphics, is that a reskin? I guess it is, but for some people there might just be the appropriate updating of a game because they don't want to see those mechanics get changed. But that's exactly the kind of point that I was talking about, and maybe the phrase itself of a reskin now has just too much negativity associated with it, that when you say reskin, what you're kind of saying is lazy update, you know, as in not much is updated. But it seems to me that people seem to really struggle with this idea of, like I said in the video before, this idea that, okay, sometimes you've just got a game to a sweet spot, you know, if it works, it works. And really, people have got this idea in their head now that unless something mechanically changes, that's not worth full price. And this really comes back to this topic we've had ongoing for quite a few weeks now of the value of things, you know. What is the value of something? Some people see obviously that every single game must be priced at a certain point based on has it had a full development. What constitutes a full development? Well, I suppose starting from scratch, going through having to develop your mechanics, your gameplay, your maps, all the graphics, all these kind of things, as opposed to having all that set up already and then literally just creating some new content for it, maybe revising the graphics a little bit. And to be fair, that is a legitimate perspective, because when you think about it, you can see that theoretically there should be less development time there when all you're doing is kind of essentially refreshing things up again. But then the devs might go ahead and release that game with a full price tag on it. And maybe this comes back to my idea of wanting to do a discussion with an industry expert to shed some light on the true value of things. But again, ultimately at the end of the day, value is subjective. This is the whole thing. This whole thing is very subjective. And that's why it leads to a lot of debate and discussion, because ultimately what you see as one thing, another person does not. That's why it's very, very tricky. At the same time, I don't feel like devs should be beholden to have to always justify themselves in terms of, oh, look at all the stuff we've added, and that's why it's worthwhile. Like I said before, I think they should own it. Just own it. Like, if you feel confident in the game that you have already produced with your mechanics and so on, just own that fact and say, look, we believe in the game as it stands right now, so what we have done is we've refreshed the game, provided some new content, the game that you love, instead of trying to hash it out and then fucking it up in the process. And there are a litany of examples of that happening. Now, Reality Check says, I think the real problem with reskin games are that the buyer of said game is spending full price for a new game that they've already purchased before. With Civ, at least the 5th iteration was a massive success. I still play the game with friends all the time. My friends and I have a combined total of about 6,000 hours on Civ 5, so I guess you could say we understand the game. The problem with Civ 6 was that it really didn't build upon those original features that we loved in Civ 5. If anything, Civ 6 was pretty watered down in some aspects and more confusing and ridiculous in others. This day and age, I think game developers think we are stupid and will buy anything that they throw at us, and it's the unfortunate truth. With Call of Duty, it's the same thing every time, same iteration. Loot boxes here, loot boxes there. I don't even want to get into microtransactions. Just to make it short, I think big publishers have ruined the face of video games with their greed and arrogance, their lack of respect for trusted gamers who pay hundreds and hundreds, if thousands of dollars every year to play their games, their shit games. I think in the future game developers are going to realise that publishers ended up destroying the fabric of gaming culture long and short term. I'd go on and on, but I think you get it. Thanks for letting me release this flame. I think it's a good point, and I think also it raises the question of, have publishers kind of destroyed, if not some franchises, then yeah, do they have overtly a negative impact on the gaming industry? Because publishers at the end of the day, whilst they might claim to be all about games and have all the passion for games, they're not necessarily the ones making the games. They're marketing, selling, and trying to profit off of those games. And, you know, there's a point to be made that sometimes these publishers destroy these titles, and you see more and more companies actually saying that they don't want to have to, you know, be under the banner of a publisher. Okay, look at something like Elite Dangerous and Planet Coaster, okay? So Frontier don't have a publisher. They are self-published. A lot of indie games are also self-published because they don't want to have to be under the banner of a publisher. They don't want to have someone above them saying, actually, you can't do that, and hey, by the way, you need to somehow get this into your game, because that's what companies like EA and Ubisoft do. Jiro comes in and says, releasing basically what's a reskin, in my opinion that is okay, if, and as you see it's a big if, the price is right. Namely, either a reskin should be a cheap DLC, just an updated texture pack, so only costing $5, $10, maybe even $15 on really big titles. It shouldn't be a $20 to $60 release of the game, unless the game is really old and they're updating more than just the graphics and it turns into a whole new game, like the new Dark Souls remake that's coming out. If it's just updating the graphics and not changing anything else in the game, it really should only cost $15. But more than likely, I wouldn't be surprised if it's priced at $40 or even a full $60. The major problem behind the concept is, as like somebody else said in the comments, they're basically asking people to rebuy the same game. And Sony does this very heavily with their older Final Fantasy games, like Final Fantasy VI alone was re-released on the SNES originally, then twice on the PS1, on the PS3, on the PS4, and even on the PC now. Owning both a PS3 and PS4, I bought it on the PS3 originally, but if I want to play it on my PS4, I've got to rebuy it at full price, which is just asking too much to me. With older console games, it's going to be a lot harder to do, but with digital games, it'd be nice if they can check and actively see if you own the original game. They do have your game accounts, don't they? And either give the reskin for free or heavily discount it at least. To me, that would be more fair, and some Steam games already do that. If you already own the first game, the updated version will be permanently cheaper to buy for you, such as The Ship or even like Divinity Original Sin. It would be nice if all games did this. It's a tricky thing back with the monetary stuff again, because ultimately, like I say, it's kind of subjective, and what's worth something to one person is not to another. But the other thing is that when you think about it, yes, although something is being updated in quite a minimal way with just maybe a reskin and a graphical update and so on, like an HD remaster or whatever, that might not seem like a lot of work. It's almost like a diminishing return, you know, because that's the real thing. And maybe that's why they end up having to do this, because it's kind of like, look, if you just make a reskin, a graphical update on itself, the amount that you technically probably should be charging for it should be less, because what you're adding to the game is very, very little. But the amount of work you actually have to do there in terms of getting that stuff all put together, finished, and getting it out probably is disproportionate to the amount of profit you might make from sales. And so could that be why they end up adding and changing different things around when they actually release these new titles, because they kind of have to justify the actual cost of the development, and thereby making it seem a product which should be selling for more. Kron comes in and says, one interesting example about reskin games is the original 2 Battlefront games that people loved so much, and people still talk about this all the time. Most people seem to forget that at the core, they were just Battlefield 1942, Battlefield 2 with Star Wars skins, except for space combat and the third-person camera. And when they announced that DICE was making Battlefront 2015, I mean, people cried out and complained like crazy that it's going to suck because they're just going to make it a reskin of Battlefield 4. And how did the game turn out? As far from Battlefield and the original Battlefront as it could have been. I don't want to say that it sucked. I will. It sucked. But it was a wasted potential. But the big question is, could it have been better if it was just a Star Wars reskin of Battlefield 4? Yes, fucking my god, yes. In my opinion, it could have been much better if it was, because it had been close to what people loved about the first 2 Battlefront games. I'm not sure that that's a true statement though, because I think people, like I say, I think people literally wanted a reskin. This is actually a really good example. This is what people wanted with that Battlefront game. They just wanted a reskin. That's all people wanted. They loved the first game so much, and they literally just wanted that, but an updated version. If they had done that, I think it would have guaranteed been a success. And this is what's so difficult to understand, is like, for crying out loud, the whole community is right there going, yes, give us this thing, and they're like, yeah, actually no, we're going to go, we think we're going to do this other thing that nobody else is asking for, we're going to do that. Honestly. He says, I imagine that it's going to be different, like Battlefield 4 was different from Battlefield 2, but it would have been close to what fans wanted and what they considered to be what Battlefront is supposed to be like. Or how about this? How about just do what the fans wanted? You know, that's like a completely insane, crazy thing to do, but you know, maybe just go for that. So I think we finish in a good position here, guys, on the reskin topic. It's a difficult one because from a developer point of view, I can understand that they don't want to come out and necessarily say like, hey, yeah, we're just going to reskin this game and ship it out there. Because like I say, you end up having that kind of diminishing returns issue where if they were to technically charge what people think they're getting in terms of actually updated content, it's maybe not going to actually pay for the cost of what it's done. Now, I don't have the numbers for that. That's literally just my speculation. That's just my kind of guesswork. But I would imagine that seems to make sense. sense. On the other hand, I think these days people just like it when you're upfront and straight and you just say like, hey, yeah, this is this thing. You know it's good, we know it's good, we're just going to update it and ship it and you're going to love it, you know? Just be upfront, don't bullshit people, don't fuck around. Just say like, yeah, we know you like this, we like it too, here, have some more. I don't think it always has to be a DLC, okay? It doesn't always have to be a DLC. I know people like to think like, why bother to release it as a separate title when it could just be a DLC? It really just depends on the amount of content, because of course, remember, you do have that issue always of breaking apart a community and segmenting a community when you bring DLC into an existing game. And that was actually one of the reasons that the guys who are doing Verdun and Tannenberg, that's why they wanted to do Tannenberg as a separate game. Now people can be cynical and say like, oh no, it's just because they wanted to get extra profit. You know, believe whatever you want, but that's what they said. They said that Tannenberg, they put it out as a separate game and a separate entity because they feel like the people that are playing Verdun, it's a slightly different playstyle, it's a slightly different feel, and they wanted to not have that idea of kind of breaking up and segmenting the community. If you prefer one or the other, then that's what you go to play with. And it's like, I don't know, yeah, maybe that's a fair point to make. For me, I think the main issue is just that the terminology of reskin has come to mean kind of lazy, not bothered, just giving it a soft update, and people kind of use it in a really derogatory manner, usually when a game has been put out there and they don't feel like it's been updated enough, and so people just say, oh yeah, they've just reskinned the game. So maybe suggesting developers should be kind of coming out and saying like, oh yeah, we've just reskinned our game is not the correct way to go with this. But I think what we could do is say that developers should be more confident to just update a game and say, look, we have updated this product because we know that you love it. We didn't want to get in there and mess around and tweak and change things. I think devs should maybe relax a little bit about kind of, you know, feeling like they're obligated to make a ton of changes just for the sake of it being an update. At the end of the day, I can't imagine a dev is actually going to come out and do this, because the idea of coming out and just saying straight up like, yep, so we're just going to deliver basically the same thing but do a graphical update, I couldn't imagine that people would be constructive enough to actually see the value in that, and that they would just jump on board the bandwagon of, oh my god, they haven't done anything, this is a reskin, blah blah, and you see straight away that negativity comes in, when actually what they would be doing is just giving people more of what they want. Now I'm sure some people come in and just say, hey, why not just do a big DLC, why not just do a big upgrade? I think there is actually a lot of merit to that. I think it's always a good thing now that we do actually have the ability to do these big DLCs, these big updates. You know, that used to never be a thing. You know, you used to ship your game and then you had to wait for the next game. You didn't have DLCs and patches and updates, and it does work. It does work for some companies. Look at games like Company of Heroes. Company of Heroes have consistently updated their games over a period of many years. And let's think back to even recently with Total War and Total War Rome 2. They just did a big update for that game. And again, I know some people were kind of cynical about that, but you know, that is a thing which happened. So these things do happen. It's not completely unprecedented that companies don't support their titles long after release. But just keep in mind that when DLCs come out, as opposed to a brand new product or just even a new release of a product, DLCs never sell as well. And that's always going to, of course, be something that developers I expect are keeping in mind. I think just own it, just be solid, just say, look, this is what we believe, this is the price we want to put on our product. If you don't like it, don't buy it. Because at the end of the day, like I've said before, that's what it comes down to. You can argue about the value of things whichever way you want. You can say this should be $10, it should be $20, it should be $15, it should be $30, it should be $60. You can argue however you want it to. Devs could put out whatever they want and they can charge whatever they want. It's their product, they can do whatever they want with that pricing scheme. It's a subjective thing. Value is different depending on who you are, how much money you earn, how much you enjoy something. Take, for example, miniatures. Look at Warhammer 40,000. For many people, the worth of those miniatures is disproportionate. Okay, they're very expensive. Warhammer 40k miniatures from Games Workshop, they're very expensive. If it's something that you like, that's how value works. If it is worth it enough to you, okay, that you want to spend your spare money on that product, then you're going to do that. And then basically, if enough people agree that this is worth it, then enough people buy that product, and that kind of establishes the value of that thing. So if a game company came out with an update for a game that was very popular, and they didn't change that much, they kind of essentially, like I say, kind of updated the graphics, they did very little there, and they decided to charge $35, $40 for it. Now, if enough people bought that product, that would determine that that value was about right. But if no one bought it and it didn't make any money, then they would know that they had charged too much. That's how value works. Now, you might not like a product being sold more than you think personally it's worth, but then that's how value works. If you don't think it's worth your money to spend on it, then you don't spend that money. That's how it works. And if enough people agree with you that it wasn't worth the money, then they will have known that they've made a mistake, and in the future it helps to establish the value of things. So just keep in mind, people saying it's too expensive, it's not worth it, blah blah blah, that's not an arbitrary thing, okay? It's a subjective thing and it differs for everybody, it's very different each time, and just saying everything is expensive all the time doesn't mean that it's true. Thanks for watching as always, guys. Remember, our main topic for today to comment down below was about the unlocking of weapons in games, which is more positive, having some kind of unlocking system with an experience base behind it, or just having all weapons unlocked. I'll see you guys next week for some more Below the Line.